I'm not the only person who either has learned or is going to learn the hard way that when we try to put major traumas like this, and this is still a major trauma for society as a whole. When we try to put these things behind us for the sake of moving forward, we end up doing more harm than good, not just for ourselves, but as clinicians for the patients we're taking care of. So it's got to be important to acknowledge that our experiences were very real and we can't put them behind us, because no matter how hard we try to, we still bring them with us in every encounter and every day.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Shrinking Burnout. This is Dr. Radhakrishnan, and I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Andrew Wu. I know it's definitely been a while since we last released an episode. It's been a crazy couple of months, and we're definitely still deep in the midst of COVID. So today, we're joined here by Chris, a second-year psychiatry resident physician working in a major academic institution. Before we hear more about Chris's story, let's recap what our last few sessions have been about.
Hi guys, this is Dr. Wu here. So if you guys recall, back in March, we had a series of episodes entitled The COVID-19 Experience, where we were able to get a couple of clinicians on to talk about their experiences of working and living during the COVID surge. And I think what was really impressive with all of these clinicians were the fact that they demonstrated a lot of resilience and flexibility to adapt to the constantly changing and stressful work environment. Furthermore, they also highlighted the difficult dilemma that clinicians are still put in every day when they go to work and they come back home and have to put themselves and their family in danger for the betterment of their patients. So for this episode, we're going to call it the COVID Surge Revisited. Now that we're a few months out from the peak, but still having to live in a COVID world, what sorts of insights can we gain from taking a look back about how doctors worked, lived, survived, coped, and moved on from the COVID surge? So for today's episode, we have Chris, a second-year psychiatry resident. Chris, why don't you tell us about yourself?
Hi guys, my name's Chris. I'm a second-year psychiatry resident at a major academic center in the Northeast. I had the experience of working on a COVID-only unit during my medicine rotations as an intern last year, during the, I would say, beginnings to the height of the COVID pandemic.
All right. Well, Chris, we're happy to have you on. Chris, I guess I'm wondering if you could tell us how you view your experience working during the COVID surge now as of September 2020.
That's a really good question, Andrew. So looking back now, I would say my views and my experience were a lot different than they were transitioning from my life as a medicine intern during the COVID pandemic to a psychiatry intern. You know, we talk about the concept of resilience, and you guys have done a fantastic job of highlighting that in your prior episodes. But thinking back on what my life was like when I was transitioning back to the life of a psychiatry intern, thinking back on it now, I realize a lot of things that I didn't know then. You know, I thought in order to be resilient, in order to survive as an intern, I sort of had to put those heartbreaking experiences behind me in order to just make it day through day, in order to do what was expected of me, in order to try to be the best version of myself for my patients, for my coworkers. And, you know, this sounds bad to say, but even for myself. But then as time went on, as I completed intern year and then I started my second year residency, I, started reflecting more on my experience on the medicine floors and started reflecting more on my experience as a psychiatrist coming off of the medical floors. And I started noticing some consistencies in my patient care and my day-to-day interactions that were very concerning and alarming to me, because when I was able to take a step back and kind of view things from a bird's eye perspective, because, it's hard to do that in the heat of the moment, I saw a lot of signs that were very worrisome for burnout.
And Chris, can you tell us more about what these worrisome signs were?
Yeah. So, it was the little things. And, we say this a lot in life, but it is true. And it's no more truer than it is in patient care. It's the little things often add up to huge impacts. And it was, things that I never had seen in myself before. And just to provide you with specific examples, it was being annoyed with the littlest things in patients' encounters, like when patients were, asking for me to go the extra mile, which normally I'm the extra mile kind of person. That's what I've always prided myself on. But I found when I was often having to bend over backwards and do even more than that was expected to me, that just kind of like struck something in me and just made me like just like even more on edge. And I'm just like looking back now, I'm like, who was that guy? And it just started to really concern me. And there was even other things, like not just in my patient interactions, but more in my day-to-day interactions with my coworkers. I was starting to get impatient with things. I was starting to avoid social interactions with people because was just tired. And when you start looking at all these little pieces together, it really paints a picture that you're not happy with looking at.
And if you feel comfortable sharing, I guess one thing that we have talked about over the last few episodes is the idea of burnout and depression, and how the two it can sometimes be really hard to differentiate between the two. And often, when you think about the actual meaning of differentiating the two, sometimes it's more acceptable or easy to admit that you're feeling burnt out and I'm talking from personal experience, than it is to admit that, hey, I think I'm actually depressed. And so I'd be curious to hear, did that thought also come up for you during that period of time?
So it actually did. I'll be honest. As I've started to accept, who I am and where I'm at in my, current mental health and my own journey, I've become a lot more open and honest about the things I've experienced because I feel like it can only benefit others. So for me, I'm somebody who's struggled with depression intermittently throughout my life. I'm no stranger to it. And, when I started seeing these warning signs, it made me scared that I was kind of slipping back into another depressive episode. But then I started wondering, I started entering the state of denial. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. Everything's great. Look, everything's going well for me. Like there couldn't be possibly anything wrong. But what's weird about it, it was me actively denying signs of burnout leading to depression. I couldn't be depressed because I'm not burnout. So for me in my own story, it's not so much as me differentiating one from the other, but I strongly feel for me personally, it was my own experiences with burnout, my denial of burnout that ultimately led to me becoming depressed.
And that's such a powerful thing to say, and we really appreciate you being honest and open with us like that. It can be really, really difficult to also accept that you are feeling depressed and that you do need help. And I'm really glad to hear that it sounds like things are a little bit better now. And so I was also hoping to hear on that note, what helped you get through that period of time and look forward?
Yeah, so for me, it was ultimately coming to accept that that's what I was going through. I ultimately came to a point where I was like, look at where denial has gotten me this far. And I didn't like what I was seeing. It wasn't meeting the expectations that I had for myself, the images that I had built for myself. Ultimately what I told myself was, if I could go back to match day and envision how I thought of myself as a resident to where I am now, what would I think? And that was a big turning point for me. Because, that was before a lot of these unfortunate circumstances happened. A lot of these unforeseen things happened. So if I could go to that more innocent, if you would, viewpoint, what would I think? And that was a big turning point for me. And that was when I decided that it was time to start asking for help, because it's important to really acknowledge that you do need help, and it's never a sign of weakness to ask for it.
And Chris, I think this is something that, we really try to stress, which is that it isn't a sign of weakness to ask for help. And also at the same time, with all of the layers of stigma behind disclosing burnout, disclosing mental illness, it can still feel really hard to actually take that first step. Can you say more about whether or not it was hard for you to make that initial plunge or make that call?
Oh my God, without a doubt. It was incredibly painful for me to take that plunge, because essentially I was having to admit to myself that I was depressed again. And honestly, what was the worst and probably the hardest thing for me to admit to myself wasn't that I was, struggling with depression again. Because like I said, I'm not a stranger to that. And I accepted a long time ago that I'm going to have good periods and bad periods. For me, the hardest part was saying, Chris, you're burnout, because I had always envisioned myself as somebody who that couldn't happen. I'm resilient, but it's important to realize that even if you're resilient, you can still be a victim of burnout.
And Chris, this is actually something that I think is very fascinating, with this whole nature of burnout being an occupational phenomenon. This profession is something that I would imagine, Chris, you've dreamed about your entire life. You've worked really hard to get here, to be a medical student, to be a doctor. And, you hit this experience of working in a COVID unit during your intern year. And it's essentially the job that you worked so hard to get is something that causes you to feel worse about yourself. And I would imagine that in itself is part of the difficulty of being able to acknowledge that it was burnout in this case for you.
Without a doubt. I mean, that was probably the hardest thing to accept about myself, was that I didn't meet the dreams I had of myself, I guess I should say. And, to kind of build on your question prior, it was incredibly hard making that first step to ask for help. I remember I hadn't yet decided I was going to ask for help, and I was sitting in my primary care physician's office for just a checkup, and he was like, "Oh, how are things going?" And I just was shaking and completely broke down and was like, "Things aren't going good." And that's honestly where it started.
So one thing that both of you said that brought to mind the idea that, is burnout truly something secondary to or associated with occupational stress or severe stress? And when you think about medicine, actually, it's so much more than just an occupation. It's almost oversimplifying that, because it ends up really becoming your life. It affects everything. And especially as a resident, it really affects every aspect, your ability to, make friendships, meet people, maintain relationships. It affects everything. You're not working normal hours. And so at that point, it becomes, is it truly burnout? Is it depression? Does it matter if we differentiate between the two?
And Chris, you mentioned that the first step was incredibly hard for you, and it sounds like you're grateful that you were actually able to take that first step. How do you maintain this sense of progress for you in terms of wanting to keep on going forward and keep on getting the best out of your training, keep on doing the extra mile for your patient?
So for me, going forward, I think what's going to be important is to always keep in mind what I had envisioned for myself, what kind of physician I always envisioned myself to be, and to never forget that. And also going forward, I've learned to modify my own personal definition of resilience. I've kind of built upon the standard definition of resiliency to also include a caveat that, for me, resiliency is also learning to be the best version of yourself despite the circumstances, but realizing that sometimes to be the best version of ourselves, we need extra help. And sometimes that help comes in the form of therapy. Sometimes that help comes in the form of medication management. And sometimes it's both. And that's okay, because for me, It's whatever it takes for me to be the best version of myself, for my patients, for my coworkers, for my family, and for my loved ones.
Chris, thank you so much for sharing with us and the listeners your experiences about burnout and about mental health.
So I just wanted to shift a little bit and make sure that we touch on this. Is there a very real tendency to want to just move on and forget about all of this? And, I think about this a lot, and I think there's a real push to want to just keep moving forward. And especially during the summer, the weather started getting nicer, things are opening up. I'm guilty of this as well, but wanting to go out and do things and, that craving for social contact and interaction and having things go back to normal. But it's not normal right now. It really isn't, no matter how much we want it to be. And, I'm wondering when it hits January, February, whenever the vaccine comes out, what is the world going to look like? And do we have to so aggressively tell ourselves, we got to get over this, we got to get through this? Or is this something that we're going to have to deal with as like a international trauma?
I agree wholeheartedly with what you said. I mean, this is something that we do have to deal with. I think I'm not the only person who either has learned or is going to learn the hard way that when we try to put major traumas like this, and this is still a major trauma for society as a whole. When we try to put these things behind us for the sake of moving forward, we end up doing more harm than good, not just for ourselves, but as clinicians for the patients we're taking care of. So it's got to be important to acknowledge that our experiences were very real and we can't put them behind us, because no matter how hard we try to, we still bring them with us in every encounter and every day.
Literally could not have said it any better. Thank you so much, Chris, for being so honest, open, for your candor. We really appreciate it, and we're so happy to have you on the show. And to our listeners, thank you so much for your support and for listening to this episode of Shrinking Burnout. So listeners, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Please email us at shrinkingburnout@gmail.com and follow us on Instagram @shrinkingburnout.
Shrinking Burnout is a podcast about furthering the discussion of clinician burnout and recognizing the resilience and hard work that clinicians regularly demonstrate. Nothing on this show should be taken as medical or psychiatric advice. All of the opinions expressed on this podcast are solely our own and do not reflect those of our employer.